Ladies and gentlemen, you ever notice how the world is always watching, always judging, always doubting what it doesn't understand? That's exactly how transformation begins, in silence, in the shadows. With people whispering, guessing, and underestimating you. Now they're saying Iran's making secret alliances. Like it's some kind of mystery, like something's about to go down, and guess what? Something is. Because when the world sleeps on you, that's when you move. That's when you strategize. That's when you prepare your shockwave. Every great shift in history started with disbelief. Folks laughed, doubted, mocked, until they were staring at the results, jaw on the floor, saying, "Man, I didn't see that coming." But see, that's what power does. It doesn't shout, it builds, it connects, it evolves. So whether you're talking about a nation finding new strength, or a person you finding your purpose in silence, just know the alliance is already forming. You might not see it. Your haters won't admit it, but behind the curtain, greatness is moving. What happens next will shock the world not because it's loud, but because it's undeniable. They'll ask, how did they do it? Where did this power come from? And the answer will be simple. We did the work while they were talking. So to every dreamer, every underdog, every person out there being misunderstood or overlooked, I want you to remember this. Let them sleep on you. Let them doubt you, because while they do, you build your alliances, you craft your purpose, you shock the world. Let them talk. You keep moving. Because when you show up with power, they didn't expect that ain't noise. That's the sound of destiny walking in the room. Let the world be shocked. You knew it all along. Let me talk to you real quick. You ever notice how the world pays attention only when things get loud? But the real power, the real change, it don't happen in the spotlight. It happens in the shadows, quietly, carefully, and right now, people are talking about Iran's secret alliances, like something's brewing. Like something's moving under the surface, and guess what? They're right. Because whether it's with Russia, China, or other unexpected players, something is shifting in a way that's gonna wake folks up real quick. The kind of shift that don't just change the game, it rebuilds the whole board. See, Iran isn't out here bragging, they're building. While the world points fingers and throws headlines, Iran is doing what a lot of folks forget to do. Stay silent, stay strategic, and let the results speak for themselves. And Russia, that alliance ain't just about politics. It's about mutual understanding, mutual benefit. Russia's been deep in Syria, and Iran's been there too. They've shared the same ground, the same airspace, the same enemies. That's not just cooperation. That's bonding in battle. And when you build something in war, it don't break easy. That relationship has matured into military coordination, weapons transfers, drones, technology, strategy, and believe me, that kind of exchange, it ain't casual, it's intentional. It's preparing for something bigger. But let me make this clear, it's not about war, it's about power, and power ain't always destructive. Sometimes it's just about not being pushed around anymore. See, when you've been sanctioned, isolated, underestimated for years, you either fold or you find new ways to stand tall. That's what Iran's doing, and the world. They're gonna act surprised, but they shouldn't be. Because every single time people write you off, every time they dismiss you, that's when your greatest transformation starts. And maybe you're not a nation. Maybe you're just a person watching this unfold, thinking it's about politics, but it's bigger than that. It's about what it means to be counted out and come back stronger. It's about alliances between countries, yes, but also between people, between ideas, between everything that grows quietly before it shocks the world. Iran isn't making noise for the cameras. They're forming relationships that don't need validation. They're stacking connections that have long-term vision, because they know, just like you should know, Greatness doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it shows up when nobody's looking. So when folks say what happens next will shock the world, believe them. Because real moves are being made, and while the world is looking left, the shift is happening on the right. That shock, it won't be chaos, it'll be clarity. The clarity of understanding that power, real power, doesn't need to announce itself. It just is, and by the time the world catches on, it's already here. Let me talk to you real quick. People love to talk when they think they know everything. They read a headline, hear a whisper, and suddenly they think they've got the whole world figured out. But let me tell you something real. The most powerful moves in history have always happened in silence, in the quiet, behind closed doors, and right now, people are throwing around phrases like Iran's secret alliances, like it's some conspiracy theory, like it's a shocking surprise, but the truth, it's strategy, it's survival, it's evolution. Because when you've been isolated, sanctioned, and pushed into a corner for decades, you either break down or you start looking for new ways to stand up and stand strong. That's what Iran's doing. They're not just surviving anymore, they're building, slowly, smartly, and with intent. One of the biggest shifts, the partnership with China. Back in 2021, they signed a 25-year cooperation agreement, one that the rest of the world tried to downplay. But that deal is a cornerstone. It's not just trade and oil. It's infrastructure, telecommunications, finance, and long-term military cooperation. China sees Iran not as a liability, but as a strategic player in the heart of the Middle East. And Iran, they see China as a lifeline away from Western pressure. That's not just politics. That's a recalibration of global power, and it doesn't stop there. Russia is deep in the mix. Military cooperation between Iran and Russia has reached levels that make Western analysts nervous, and for good reason. The two countries have collaborated in Syria, exchanged weapons technology, and even shared strategies in dealing with sanctions. It's not a loose handshake, it's a tightening bond. Iran has provided drones to Russia during the Ukraine conflict, and in return, Russia is giving Iran something just as valuable: legitimacy and leverage. When you've got China and Russia in your corner, you're not isolated anymore, you're positioned. People think alliances are about treaties on paper, but the real ones, they're forged through shared struggle, through necessity, through years of being pushed out and finding your own way in. And when that kind of foundation is laid, the result isn't noise, it's shock. The world wakes up and realizes the game has changed. The pieces are moving in a whole new direction. Iran isn't screaming from the rooftops. They don't have to. Their actions are speaking, and soon the whole world will hear them. What happens next isn't just about Iran. It's about what happens when underestimated forces start connecting, when the isolated start organizing, and when silence becomes strategy. The shock that's coming isn't random, it's earned, it's calculated. It's been building for years, and when it finally hits, it won't just be a headline, it'll be a turning point. People often misunderstand the nature of power. They think it's all about headlines, armies, or who can speak the loudest on the world stage. But real power, lasting power, moves quietly. It builds over time beneath the radar through networks, loyalties, and shared struggle. That's exactly how Iran has expanded its influence across the Middle East, not just with official state relationships, but through a web of alliances with non-state actors and militias that have grown stronger year by year. When people talk about Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, or the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, they're only scratching the surface. These aren't just loosely affiliated partners. These are deeply rooted alliances built through shared ideology, financial support, training, and years of strategic alignment. Iran's strength doesn't come from the size of its army alone. It comes from the influence it holds in cities, in regions, and in battlefields far beyond its borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon is one of the clearest examples. Formed with Iranian backing in the 1980s, Hezbollah has become more than a militia. It's a political force, a military power, and a deeply embedded part of Lebanese society. It doesn't just answer to Tehran, it aligns with it, ideologically and strategically. Every time there's a flare-up along Israel's northern border, the world gets a small glimpse of just how deep that alliance runs. Iran doesn't need to deploy troops when it can influence outcomes through forces already on the ground. Forces that are local but loyal. The same is true in Iraq, where Iranian-backed militias, now formally part of the Iraqi security forces, hold significant power, sometimes more than the government itself. These militias are trained, equipped, and ideologically tied to Iran's vision of regional resistance against Western and Israeli influence. In Yemen, the Houth movement has transformed from a marginalized group into a powerful force, largely through Iranian support. What started as a local uprising has become part of a much larger geopolitical struggle, with Iran using the Houthis to counterbalance Saudi influence and stretch its reach to the southern Arabian Peninsula. This is not random, this is strategic. Iran doesn't just back these groups to create chaos, it backs them to build a new balance of power, one that favors Tehran's long-term interests. And in Syria, Iran's presence has been crucial in keeping Bashar al-Assad in power. By deploying not only its own Revolutionary Guard forces, but also mobilizing fighters from Hezbollah and other proxies, Iran has effectively secured a corridor of influence from Tehran to the Mediterranean. All of this is often called asymmetric warfare, but it's more than that. It's asymmetric statecraft. It's diplomacy by other means. While the world sees militias, Iran sees partners. While others see chaos, Iran sees leverage. And the more these alliances strengthen, the more the world will be forced to confront a reality it long tried to ignore. Iran is not just a country. It is a central player in a vast, growing network of power that stretches across borders, ideologies, and generations. When people hear about Iran and North Korea in the same sentence, most assume it's just two isolated, sanctioned countries, occasionally trading black market goods, or sharing a mutual dislike for Western influence. But the reality is far more complex and far more strategic. These are two nations that have spent decades under intense international pressure, economic isolation, and military threats. And while they may seem like unlikely partners on the surface, necessity has a way of bringing people together. What exists between Iran and North Korea is not just occasional cooperation. It is a quiet, calculated, and evolving relationship rooted in shared resistance and mutual benefit, especially in the realm of missile and military technology. For years, there have been credible reports and intelligence assessments suggesting that North Korea has helped Iran advance its ballistic missile program. In fact, much of Iran's early missile development, particularly during and after the Iran-Iraq War, is believed to have been influenced by North Korean designs and components. These were not gifts. They were transactions, partnerships born out of isolation and desperation, but guided by strategic alignment. North Korea has long had one of the most secretive and militarized regimes in the world. And while their nuclear weapons program grabs headlines, their missile exports have quietly shaped conflicts elsewhere. Iran, unable to buy high-tech arms openly, turned to nations that were willing to defy international restrictions. Over time, this arrangement grew. Technical experts were exchanged, knowledge was shared. What North Korea lacked in economic power, it compensated for with missile designs, manufacturing methods, and covert logistics. Iran, on the other hand, provided money, oil, and access to a different part of the world. This wasn't just a buyer-seller relationship. It was two nations teaching each other how to survive under pressure and outmaneuver global scrutiny. The Shahab missile series, for example, is widely believed to have origins in North Korea's Nadong missile. Iran took what North Korea had developed and improved upon it, expanding range, increasing payloads, and adapting it for its own strategic purposes. And while neither country admits these exchanges publicly, their technological similarities speak volumes. Over time, as Iran has progressed toward more sophisticated missile systems, some capable of reaching distant targets in the region and possibly beyond, the fingerprints of North Korean influence remain. What makes this alliance particularly concerning to many around the world is that both nations have aspirations that go beyond defense. They seek leverage, they seek deterrence, and they seek to be seen not as pariahs, but as powers that can't be ignored. This quiet cooperation becomes even more significant when seen through the lens of global conflict. While the U.S., Israel, South Korea, and their allies monitor each country individually, the possibility of deeper collaboration between them creates a more complicated threat matrix. The world is not just dealing with two rogue states operating independently. It may be facing a clandestine, in partnership that has survived for decades and continues to evolve in the shadows. And if that's true, the shock isn't just in what they've done. It's in what they're capable of next. Iran's support for groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad is not simply a matter of ideology or shared religion. It is a central piece of its long-term regional strategy. For decades, Iran has positioned itself as the leader of the so-called Axis of Resistance, a network of state and non-state actors that challenge Western influence and, most significantly, oppose the existence and expansion of Israel. In this context, Iranian backing of Palestinian militant groups in Gaza serves multiple strategic goals at once. It allows Iran to exert influence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without being physically present. It creates a pressure point on Israel's southern border that can be activated in response to events in Lebanon, Syria, or even Iran itself. And it gives Iran a level of symbolic leadership in the broader Islamic world, as a champion of the Palestinian cause when many Arab governments have begun to normalize relations with Israel. Iran's relationship with Hamas has evolved over time. Despite the Sunni-Shia divide, Hamas being a Sunni Islamist group and Iran being a Shia-majority nation with a Shia-led government, both parties have maintained a relationship grounded in mutual interests rather than sectarian alignment. Hamas controls Gaza, and Gaza is a key flashpoint in the broader regional conflict. Iran's support includes financial assistance, weapons transfers, military training, and intelligence sharing. It is widely believed that Iranian funding helps Hamas develop and stockpile the rockets that are periodically fired into Israel. Some of these rockets have been manufactured locally in Gaza, with materials and guidance believed to come from Iranian sources. This cooperation has allowed Hamas to develop a domestic weapons industry, despite the heavy blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt. Palestinian Islamic Jihad PIJ, a smaller but highly active militant group, has even closer ties to Tehran. Unlike Hamas, which has a political wing and runs the civil administration in Gaza, PIJ is a purely militant organization and has often been described as an Iranian proxy. Its leadership regularly meets with senior Iranian officials and receives direct financial and military support. Iran praises PJ ideological alignment with its own revolutionary principles, especially the commitment to armed struggle against Israel without compromise or political negotiation. PJ rocket attacks, tunnel construction, and guerrilla tactics are all part of a broader strategy designed and supported by Iranian advisors and technology. Iran doesn't support these groups simply to cause chaos. Every move is part of a calculated plan to reshape the power balance in the region by keeping pressure on Israel from multiple fronts: Gaza in the south, Hezbollah in the north, and militias in Syria. Iran seeks to stretch Israeli defenses thin and deter any potential strikes against its nuclear infrastructure. These alliances also serve domestic purposes, allowing Iran's leadership to rally support among hardliners and portray itself as the vanguard of Islamic resistance. The world often sees these relationships as acts of aggression, but to Iran, they are acts of deterrence, influence, and long-term strategic positioning. As these partnerships deepen, and as geopolitical tensions rise, the true extent of Iran's reach in Gaza and beyond may shock those who have long underestimated its influence. Iran's relationship with Venezuela is one of the most overlooked yet strategically significant alliances in modern geopolitics. Both countries are rich in natural resources, particularly oil, and both have spent years under heavy U.S. sanctions, cut off from international banking systems, trade networks, and diplomatic circles. This shared status as international outcasts has brought them closer together in recent years, transforming what was once a limited diplomatic connection into a full-fledged strategic partnership. This alliance is not simply about ideology, though both governments do share a mutual hostility toward U.S. influence and intervention. It is about survival, economic resilience, and mutual reinforcement in the face of global pressure. What has emerged is a quiet, resourceful cooperation that has allowed both nations to evade sanctions, prop up their economies, and maintain influence at home and abroad. Iran and Venezuela have deepened ties through oil cooperation, with Iran providing critical technical and logistical support to Venezuela's crumbling energy infrastructure. Years of neglect, mismanagement, and sanctions had left Venezuela's once thriving oil industry in ruins. Iran stepped in where others would not, sending engineers, refinery parts, and chemical additives necessary for refining heavy crude. This assistance has helped Venezuela boost fuel production and supply its domestic market, while also giving Iran a foothold in Latin America, region historically dominated by U.S. interests. In return, Venezuela has provided Iran with shipments of gold and other valuable resources, often under the radar, using secretive transport methods and state-controlled companies to mask the true nature of these transactions. These exchanges have allowed Iran to generate revenue outside the reach of international sanctions, funding its domestic economy and regional ambitions. Flights between Tehran and Caracas, operated by state carriers, have become a symbol of this growing alliance. Often referred to as the Aeroterror route by critics, these flights are believed to facilitate not only commercial trade, but also intelligence sharing and possible arms transfers. Although both governments deny any illicit activity, Western intelligence agencies have expressed concern about the opaque nature of these exchanges. For Iran, Venezuela represents more than an economic partner. It is a strategic outpost in the Western Hemisphere, just a few hours from the U.S. mainland. The relationship allows Iran to project influence in a region where it has historically had little presence, and gives it a platform to build political connections with other left-leaning governments in Latin America. The ideological bond between the two regimes cannot be dismissed either. Both Iran's Islamic Republic and Venezuela's socialist leadership frame their struggle as resistance against imperialism and foreign domination. They frequently use similar rhetoric, blaming economic hardships on Western aggression and promoting a narrative of independence and defiance. This has helped each regime maintain legitimacy among its base, despite growing domestic challenges. As this alliance continues to develop, the rest of the world may come to realize that Iran's reach is no longer confined to the Middle East. Through partnerships like the one with Venezuela, Iran is extending its influence globally, often in places and ways that defy traditional expectations. A new military pact between Iran and a major global power like Russia or China would represent a turning point in international relations, one that could fundamentally alter the existing balance of power. For decades, Iran has operated largely on its own, building influence in the Middle East through proxy groups, regional alliances, and asymmetric warfare. But if Iran were to formalize a security agreement with Russia or China, particularly one that includes military guarantees, joint operations, weapons development, or even nuclear cooperation, the geopolitical landscape would shift in ways that could no longer be ignored. Such a pact would effectively bring Iran under the umbrella of a global power bloc that directly challenges U.S. hegemony and NATO influence, and it would give Tehran a level of strategic confidence it has never possessed before. For Iran, the benefits of such an agreement would be immense. It would move from being a regional actor to a global player backed by superpowers, instead of relying solely on its own deterrence. Like its missile arsenal and regional militias, Iran could theoretically call upon the support, logistics, or even defense capabilities of Russia or China in the event of a major conflict. This would drastically change the calculus for any nation considering military action against Iran, including Israel and the United States. It could deter preemptive strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or missile sites, knowing that the retaliation might involve more than just Iranian forces. A pact of this scale would be a form of insurance, and it would embolden Tehran to pursue more aggressive regional policies, secure in the knowledge that it is no longer isolated. From the perspective of Russia and China, there are compelling reasons to consider such an alliance. Iran is strategically located, controlling access to the Strait of Hormuz, a key choke point for global oil shipments. It also has vast energy resources and a well-developed domestic military industry. Russia, already working closely with Iran in Syria, views Tehran as a useful counterweight to NATO in the Middle East. China, with its growing need for energy security and its broader Belt and Road ambitions, sees Iran as a critical partner in both economic and military terms. By deepening ties with Iran, both countries can extend their influence into a region long dominated by American military bases and alliances. Perhaps the most dangerous possibility is if this military pact extends into nuclear cooperation. While Iran continues to deny pursuing nuclear weapons, any collaboration with nuclear powers like Russia or China would raise alarm bells across the globe. Even if it stops short of nuclear weapons assistance, cooperation on advanced missile systems, cyber warfare, or anti-aircraft defenses would significantly raise Iran's strategic capabilities. The mere perception of a nuclear-armed or nuclear-backed Iran would be enough to trigger arms races in the Middle East, draw new battle lines in global alliances, and increase the likelihood of conflict in already fragile areas. Such a pact would not be a declaration of war, but it would be a declaration of intent. It would say that Iran is no longer alone, that multipolarity is here to stay, and that the world's power structure is changing fast. A breakthrough in Iran's nuclear capability would not just be a regional concern. It would be a global shockwave. For years, Iran has insisted that its nuclear program is purely peaceful, dedicated to energy production and medical research. However, many countries, especially Israel and the United States, have suspected that Tehran's ambitions go much further. The possibility of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon has hovered like a storm cloud over the Middle East for decades. And while diplomatic efforts such as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action JCPOA temporarily slowed that progression, the collapse of that agreement and the subsequent ramping up of uranium enrichment have reignited fears that a nuclear threshold is near. A sudden declaration that Iran has successfully tested a nuclear device or achieved weapons grade uranium enrichment would immediately transform the security landscape, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. Such an announcement would trigger immediate and dramatic reactions. Israel, which has long stated that it will never allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, could see this as a point of no return and initiate military strikes against Iranian facilities, even at the risk of sparking a wider regional war. The United States and European powers would likely convene emergency sessions at the United Nations, but behind the scenes, military options would be quietly reviewed and contingency plans activated. Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, already wary of Iran's regional ambitions, would accelerate their own defense initiatives and possibly pursue nuclear options of their own, setting off a dangerous arms race in one of the world's most volatile regions. The geopolitical implications would go far beyond the Middle East. A nuclear Iran would shift global power dynamics, especially if it coincides with closer military ties to Russia and China. It could embolden Iran to act more assertively in places like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, leveraging its newfound deterrent to shield its proxies and partners from retaliation. This could lead to increased clashes with Western aligned states and fuel a growing confrontation between rival power blocs. U.S. influence in the region would be challenged, and NATO allies would be forced to recalibrate their strategies. The nuclear umbrella, once limited to a few major players, would now include a revolutionary Islamic republic that openly challenges Western order, and that shift would rattle both allies and adversaries alike. Domestically, such a development would strengthen hardliners in Iran who have long advocated for resistance over negotiation. The regime would likely portray the achievement as a national triumph, a symbol of sovereignty and strength in the face of foreign pressure. But it could also isolate Iran even further, inviting even harsher sanctions, cyber attacks, and covert operations aimed at undermining its capabilities. However, the real danger lies not just in the weapon itself, but in how its mere existence changes the stakes. Deterrence may prevent immediate conflict, but it also raises the risk that any future clash, even a minor one, could spiral out of control with devastating consequences. Iran's potential involvement in a joint anti-U.S. economic bloc, especially in coordination with BRICS nations, could mark a seismic shift in global trade dynamics and international finance. For decades, the U.S. dollar has been the dominant global reserve currency, underpinning the vast majority of international trade, particularly in energy markets. This supremacy gives the United States enormous influence over global economic activity, enabling it to impose sanctions, restrict access to financial systems like SWIFT, and dictate the rules of trade for much of the world. But countries like Iran, China, Russia, and others who have faced repeated economic pressure and sanctions are increasingly seeking to reduce their dependence on the dollar and build a parallel financial system. If Iran joins forces with other BRICS nations to create or adopt an alternative currency, especially for trading oil and gas, it would represent a direct challenge to U.S. economic hegemony. Iran, as one of the world's leading oil and gas producers, holds significant leverage in any conversation about energy markets. While sanctions have heavily restricted its exports, Tehran still possesses vast untapped potential. If sanctions are circumvented or lifted through cooperation with like-minded nations, Iran could return to global markets under entirely new terms. Trading its energy resources in a new BRICS-backed currency or in a basket of non-dollar alternatives would weaken the dollar's grip on oil and gas markets. Countries like China and India, both major energy importers and BRICS members, would benefit from a system that bypasses U.S. scrutiny and avoids dollar-based inflation. Russia, already forced out of the Western financial system, would see Iran as a natural ally in developing this new economic order. Together, these nations could form an energy and trade bloc that not only excludes the U.S. dollar, but also builds economic infrastructure independent of the West, including new banks, payment systems, and financial institutions. For Iran, this shift would represent more than just an economic realignment. It would be a form of strategic liberation. No longer would it be as vulnerable to U.S.-led sanctions or asset freezes. It could sell oil to China or India, receive payments in alternative currencies or digital assets, and reintegrate into the global economy on its own terms. Domestically, this could strengthen the government's position by stabilizing the economy, boosting revenues, and undermining narratives of isolation. Politically, it would allow Iran to align itself with a rising coalition of powers that challenge the Western order and promote multipolarity. For the West, such a move would be deeply unsettling. It would erode the dollar's dominance, limit the reach of U.S. economic pressure, and force a reevaluation of global economic strategy. The formation of a BRICS-aligned trading bloc with active Iranian participation would signal a shift toward a new economic reality, one where the United States can no longer dictate the rules alone. This development, once unthinkable, is now increasingly plausible, and its full impact could shake the foundations of the global financial system. A coordinated proxy conflict escalation involving Iranian-backed groups across multiple fronts would represent a dramatic and highly destabilizing shift in the balance of power in the Middle East. Iran has spent decades cultivating a network of proxy militias and allied factions throughout the region, each with its own local goals, but all operating under a loosely aligned strategic vision guided by Tehran. Hezbollah in Lebanon, various Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and Palestinian factions like Hamas and Islamic Jihad all benefit in varying degrees from Iranian funding, training, arms, and ideological support. These groups have traditionally acted independently within their own theaters, responding to local events or broader Iranian interests in a piecemeal fashion. However, the possibility of a synchronized multi-front escalation, where all these groups launch attacks within the same strategic window, would represent a calculated shift from reactive warfare to coordinated offensive strategy. Such an event could begin with rocket attacks or missile launches from Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, targeting Israeli cities and infrastructure. Simultaneously, Houthi forces in Yemen could increase drone and missile strikes on Saudi Arabia and potentially the UAE, threatening shipping lanes and oil production facilities. In Iraq, Iranian-aligned militias could launch attacks against U.S. bases or diplomatic missions aiming to create chaos and push American forces out of the country. This coordinated pressure would stretch regional defense systems, forcing Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. to respond on multiple fronts at once. The sheer scale and simultaneity of these actions would reduce the effectiveness of defense systems like Israel's Iron Dome, Saudi Patriot missile batteries, and U.S. early warning networks. Iran would likely deny direct involvement, framing the attacks as spontaneous acts of resistance by independent actors. However, the strategic coherence of the offensives would leave little doubt among analysts and military planners that the escalation was centrally inspired or at least approved. Iran's goal in such a scenario would not necessarily be to win a conventional war, but rather to overwhelm its adversaries' paralyzed decision making and demonstrate its ability to destabilize the region at will. This kind of asymmetric warfare, where the cost of defense is far greater than the cost of attack, is precisely the kind of strategy Iran has honed over the years, using low-cost, high-impact operations to exert influence far beyond its borders. The international consequences of such an escalation would be profound. The U.S. could be drawn into another Middle Eastern conflict just as it seeks to pivot its focus to Asia and Europe. Israel might respond with full-scale operations in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, while Gulf nations could be pressured into retaliating against Iran directly. The economic repercussions would also be severe. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz could be disrupted, oil prices would likely surge, and global markets could be rattled by the prospect of sustained regional war. In this scenario, Iran's proxy network would have transformed from a deterrent tool into a first-strike capability, with the power to ignite widespread conflict and force global powers to reckon with a newly emboldened and unpredictable regional axis. A revelation that Iran and its allies are engaging in coordinated cyber attacks and AI-based hybrid warfare would represent a watershed moment in the evolution of modern conflict. Unlike traditional warfare that involves armies and visible battlefields, cyber warfare is fought in the shadows, through code, servers, and systems that underpin everyday life. Leaked evidence showing that Iran, possibly with support or collaboration from technologically advanced partners like Russia or China, is conducting a broad campaign of cyber sabotage, would send shockwaves through governments, corporations, and civilian institutions worldwide. Targets could include financial networks, energy grids, water treatment facilities, transportation systems, or even election infrastructure. These attacks would not just be limited to espionage or data theft, but could escalate into real-world disruptions that harm economies, undermine public trust, and provoke geopolitical crises. Such a coordinated effort would likely be highly strategic and multi-layered. It could begin with silent infiltration. Malware implanted months or years in advance within the critical infrastructure of adversary nations. Once activated, these tools could simultaneously disable banks, black out cities, disrupt air travel, or tamper with communications during a crisis. The psychological and societal impact of these disruptions would be enormous. People would lose faith in the institutions meant to protect them, and governments might be forced to respond before fully understanding the nature or origin of the attacks. If it became evident that AI was being used to coordinate or enhance these operations, using machine learning to evade detection, predict vulnerabilities, or optimize attack timing, it would confirm fears that warfare has entered an entirely new and dangerously automated phase. For Iran, cyber warfare offers a high-impact low-cost tool to level the playing field against technologically superior adversaries. Traditional military engagement with countries like the United States or Israel carries massive risks and uncertain outcomes. But in cyberspace, Iran can strike quietly, often anonymously, and with plausible deniability. It has already built a reputation for launching cyber attacks on foreign infrastructure, including high-profile attacks against Saudi oil facilities, U.S. government entities, and Israeli water systems. Leaked proof of a coordinated effort, especially one utilizing I for maximum disruption, would suggest a leap forward in capability and intent. It would indicate that Iran is no longer just reacting to cyber threats, but is actively shaping the battlefield with next-generation tools. The implications for global security would be severe. Countries would be forced to rethink their defense strategies, prioritizing digital infrastructure as much as tanks and missiles. Private companies, often the first line of defense in cyber warfare, would scramble to fortify systems, while intelligence agencies might initiate counter-cyber operations or even physical retaliation. Escalation could be swift and unpredictable, especially if lives are lost or critical infrastructure is permanently damaged. The revelation would also redefine alliances as nations look to each other for cybersecurity partnerships, intelligence sharing, and joint technological development. What makes cyber warfare uniquely dangerous is that the line between war and peace, military and civilian, foreign and domestic, becomes blurred. In this new era, the battlefield is everywhere, and Iran's role in it would be impossible to ignore. A dramatic shift in global power could unfold in ways that defy existing predictions if Iran were to form or deepen an official strategic axis with Russia and China, deploy its troops in direct combat abroad, solidify a transformative alliance with Saudi Arabia, and aggressively integrate into the BRICS bloc with the adoption of a non-dollar digital currency. While each of these developments individually would send ripples through the international system, the convergence of all four would amount to a geopolitical earthquake that could permanently alter the architecture of global influence. These scenarios, once considered improbable or limited in scope, are increasingly within the realm of possibility given current regional dynamics, shifting alliances, and the global movement toward multipolarity. If Iran were to officially form a military and economic alliance with both Russia and China beyond informal cooperation or transactional partnerships, it would represent a definitive realignment of power in opposition to Western dominance. Already, Iran cooperates with Russia in military theaters like Syria, and shares economic interests with China, particularly under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. However, a formal tripartite alliance that includes mutual defense guarantees, integrated military training, and coordinated economic development projects would redefine the power landscape. Iran could gain access to advanced Russian and Chinese military technologies, including missile defense systems, naval equipment, and surveillance capabilities. In turn, Russia and China would benefit from Iran's strategic position on the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, granting them greater access to Middle Eastern energy resources and military presence near U.S. bases in the region. This kind of alliance would challenge NATO's monopoly on global security coordination and signal to many non-aligned countries that the U.S. led order is no longer the only viable path. Adding to that shock, Iran openly deploying its military forces beyond its borders for combat roles, not just advisors or proxy coordination, would signal a major shift in doctrine. For decades, Iran has projected influence through non-state actors and asymmetrical warfare, maintaining plausible deniability and limiting direct casualties. However, a strategic decision to place Iranian boots on the ground in a foreign conflict, be it in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, or even a flashpoint in Central Asia or Africa, would escalate regional tensions to unprecedented levels. It would also indicate that Iran sees itself no longer merely as a regional influencer, but as a military power willing to intervene directly to protect its interests or those of its allies. This move could be catalyzed by a confrontation with Israel, Turkish expansionism, a collapse of central authority in Iraq, or a major war involving U.S. allies in the region. Such a deployment would be a clear message to adversaries and a source of both inspiration and concern to nations wary of American unilateralism. Equally shocking would be a full strategic realignment between Iran and Saudi Arabia. For decades, these two powers have been at opposite ends of the sectarian and geopolitical divide in the Middle East, supporting opposing sides in virtually every conflict from Syria and Lebanon to Yemen and Bahrain. Their competition has shaped the region's modern history. However, in recent years, there has been a quiet thaw, with China brokering a diplomatic agreement in 2023 that re-established diplomatic ties. If this détente deepens into a true partnership, marked by military coordination, economic integration, or a joint vision for regional governance, it would be a historic reversal. Such an alliance could transform OPEC into a more unified bloc that actively opposes Western energy policies, redirect massive petrodollar flows into Eastern-led investment frameworks, and help stabilize conflict zones through coordinated influence. Western allies, particularly the United States and Israel, would be left reeling as their two key regional rivals not only stopped fighting each other, but joined forces to resist external influence. This new Sunni Shia convergence could also resonate deeply across the Muslim world, reducing sectarian polarization and offering a united front against Western pressures and interventions. All of these changes would be magnified exponentially if Iran also takes full advantage of its BRICS membership by pushing aggressively for a new economic paradigm built on de-dollarization and the use of digital currencies. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have already begun discussions on creating an alternative financial system to reduce reliance on the U.S. dollar. Iran's inclusion would bring with it massive energy reserves and a long history of resisting dollar-based sanctions. A successful effort to trade oil and gas using a BRICS-backed digital currency, perhaps based on a blockchain ledger and backed by commodities like gold or energy, would deal a significant blow to the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency. This would not only undermine the U.S.'s ability to enforce sanctions globally, but also reshape global trade routes, payment systems, and economic alliances. Iran, which has been locked out of Western financial systems like SWIFT and faced decades of economic warfare, would view this new system as a lifeline. For other sanctioned or economically vulnerable nations, it could offer a model for resisting Western economic control. The convergence of these events, an Iran-Russia-China axis, Iranian troop deployment abroad, a strategic Iran-Saudi alliance, and Iran's economic pivot through BRICS would fundamentally challenge the unipolar world order. Western influence would wane in key theaters, and the credibility of U.S. commitments to allies could erode. Regional wars might become more frequent, but also more multipolar in nature, with new coalitions forming across religious and ideological lines. The rise of digital currency systems would further divide the world into distinct economic spheres, potentially forcing smaller nations to choose sides in a way that hasn't been necessary since the Cold War. Intelligence agencies, military strategists, and economic planners would be forced to rewrite assumptions and prepare for a world that is no longer anchored by American primacy or Bretton Woods-era financial norms. For the Iranian government, this would be seen as vindication. Years of resistance, sanctions, proxy wars, and isolation would culminate not in collapse, as many Western analysts predicted, but in a new kind of global leadership, one built not on compromise with the West, but on coalition, building among the disaffected, the sanctioned, and the ambitious. This moment would redefine the narrative of global power. It would not only shock the world, but also set it on a radically new trajectory, where the very definitions of alliance, war, economy, and influence are no longer confined by the assumptions of the 20th century.